Welcome to i4 Institute. I am Khushbu, working as .NET software developer in i4 Technolab Private Limited. This series is about .NET framework. In last session, I discussed about MVC. In this session, I will discuss about what is MVC Web API. So we would start with basic MVP Web API and related topics. In this session, I am going to cover up following points. ASP.NET Web API, why ASP.NET MVC Web API, ASP.NET Web API features, ASP.NET Web API design, ASP.NET MVC Web API, routing table, error and exception handling, model validations. Now let's start with Web API. Now the question arises is what is Web API? So let's have a look. Web API is HTTP service that can be consumed by a broad range of clients including browsers, mobiles, iPhone and tablets. Web API responds generally in XML or JSON. JSON is nice for mobile app with slow connection. For example, call an API from jQuery and better utilize the client's machine and browser. JSON is lightweight and also it is very easy to handle and parse when comparing to XML formats. Now let's see why ASP.NET MVC Web API. It is built for all other non-human interaction website or service needs to support. Think about jQuery code that's making an AJAX request or a service interface that supports a mobile client. In these cases, the requests are coming from code and expect some kind of structured data and specific HTTP status codes. These two are very complementary but different enough that trying to build out HTTP services using ASP.NET MVC took a lot of work to get right. Now let's see the Web API features. Some of the Web API features are modern HTTP programming model, full support for routes, filters, content negotiation, improved testability of HTTP details, query composition, improved inversion of control that is IOC via dependency resolver, code-based configuration, self-host. Now let's see one by one in detail. First one is modern HTTP programming model. Directly accesses and manipulate HTTP requests and responses in web APIs using a new strongly typed HTTP object model. Second one is full support for routes. Web APIs now support the full set of route capabilities that have always been a part of the web stack, including route parameters and constraints. Additionally, mapping to actions has a full support for convention, so no longer need to apply attributes such as HTTP post to your classes and methods. Third one is filters. So Web API now supports filters including well-known filters such as authorize attribute. Next one is content negotiation. The client and server can work together to determine the right format for data being returned from an API. Provide default support for XML, JSON and form URL encoded formats and extend this support by adding your formatters. Model binding and validations. Model binders provide an easy way to extract data from various parts of an HTTP request and convert those message parts into .NET objects which can be used by the Web API actions. Improve testability of HTTP details. Rather than setting HTTP details in static context object, Web API actions can now work with instances of HTTP request message and HTTP response message. Generic versions of these objects also exist to work with custom types in addition to the HTTP types. Next one is query composition. By simple returning iQueryable T, Web API will support querying via the OData URL conventions. Improved inversion of control that is IOC via dependency resolver. Web API now uses the service locator pattern implemented by MVC's dependency resolver to obtain instances for many different facilities. Code-based configuration. Web API configuration is accomplished solely through code, leaving config files clean. Last one is self-host. Web APIs can be hosted in own process in addition to IIS while still using the full power of routes and other features of Web API. ASP.NET Web API design. Here you can see the figure of an ASP.NET Web API design. There is a communication between a client control and data access layer via HTTP request and HTTP response. Here client is whatever consumes the web API like browser, mobile app and so forth. Controller is an object that handles HTTP request and creates HTTP response. Now the client consumes web API using send request to controller. After receive request, controller generates response from data access layer using model. Receives model from data access layer, model is serialized and send a response. This process done by controller. Now let's see an example of web API. You can here see there is a public class product. In that there are 4 properties, that is public integer ID, public string name, public string category and public string type. Now how to create a controller. You can here see there is a product controller which inherits API controller. Please remark this. You have to inherit API controller when you are going to create a web API application. Here you can see there is an enumerable product method, that is getAllProduct, return repository.getAll. When you are using a web API, you are going to use a repository pattern, which I will discuss later. Let's see routing in web API. When we create a web API in MVC, it generates a default routing path in app-start-root-config file. Like you can here see there is a name default API and root template will be API / name of the controller and ID parameter if it is any. So this ID parameter is optional. Here are some of the HTTP methods, that is get, post and put. You can see first is a get. If you want to get all the products, then your URI path will be API / products. If you want to get your product by ID, then path will be API products / ID of your product. Third one is if you want products by category, then API / product in query string category equal to category name. These 3 are get methods because you want to get the data. Now if you want to insert a data, then there is a put method. So post method. So what will be your URI path, that is API / products. Now if you want to update the product, then it is a put HTTP put method and URI will be API / products / ID, the ID you want to update. Last one is HTTP delete, the HTTP delete method. If you want to delete a product, then by ID you can delete it and URI path is API products / ID. Routing table in more detail. The 4 main HTTP methods are mapped to CRUD operations. Get retrieves the representation of the resource at the specified URI. Get should have no side effects on server. Put updates a resource at specified URI. Post creates a new resource. The server assigns the URI for the new object and return this URI as a part of response message. Delete deletes a resource at specified URI. ASP.NET Web API example. Here you can see product controller have methods, that is get for getting all products, get by ID, that is get product, post for add product, put for updating a product and delete for remove product. Inside each you can see there is a repository, product repository dot get all products, product repository dot get product. So in repository, that is product repository class, there is a API methods, get all products, get product, add product, update product and remove product. Now if you want to create MVC web API, then go to file, new, project. What you want to create a web application, so web application, I'm just writing my application name, that is MVC web API. Now what will I do? I will create, click on OK. Now it will me show the templates, but what template I want is web API, so I will click on web API. Now I will click on OK. Here you can see there is a web API config file. In web API config file, you can see here the name is default API. The root template is API controller and ID. So this is and root path of API, web API. Now in this you can see there is, now in controller you can see there is an account controller. I'm just clicking on account controller. In this you can see it is inherited from API controller. This is necessary for creating a web API. Now I already created one application for MVC web API. So let me show you. I already created a demo for MVC web API. Let me start. In web config file, I just added a connection string to my database. Now in model you can see I created a public class person having a 4 properties, that is ID, name, address and date of birth. Besides that, I created a public class person entities inherited from DB context. What I have done is I'm just initializing my database to this project, that is I'm just connecting it with DB set person of person. Now I made an API folder. In that you can see there is a value controllers. So you can here see this is a value controller. It is inheriting from API controller. Now here you can see I just created an object for person entity. Now besides that you can see there is a get method which have no parameter. So it will return me a list of all the person. So second one is you can see there is a ID parameter, so it will return me a single row by ID. Now you can see here the post method. So what will happen? Whatever data will be posted will be called this method, that is post, and it will save the changes in my DB. Next one is put method. You can here see that is a put method. Suppose you want to update the data, then you have to use this method. It will modify the entity state and it will update the DB. Similarly, this is another put method. You can say this method is update through JSON. So this will behave as a JSON. Last one is you can see delete. This will delete the object, that is delete the row by ID. Now these are the just methods. So how this API controller will work with our MVC controller. In controller folder you can see there is a person controller. Now in person controller I just created an object for value controller. In value controller there are our API methods. Suppose on index method I just want all the list of person. So it will have in a get method of value controller. So what happened? I just created a object DB and I'm just accessing that object and method get. So it will have a list in this variable list and it will return view list. Now you can see here public action details. So it will have a get by ID method. So it will just give me a detail of a single person. Similarly, if I want to insert a data, then I can insert the data by using this create method. In that create method, it will call db.postPerson. So it will just insert the data in db. Next one is edit. If I want to edit, then just I have to call db.put, that is in value controller. So it will update the data. Last one is delete. I can delete the record by ID. You have to just call db.getById. Then during HTTP post, you can delete the record. Similarly, here you can also see first you have to get a HTTP get method and you have to get the data by ID, and during HTTP post it will update the data. So we learnt about how to create a MVC web API application. Now let's move ahead. Error and exception handling. Response messages, errors and exceptions are translated to HTTP response status code. Some of the status code, for example, post request should reply with HTTP status code 201. Delete request should reply with HTTP status code 204. But if a put and get request is done with an invalid ID, it should reply with HTTP status 404, that is not found. Here you can see there is an example. If the ID is not found, then it will throw a new HTTP response exception. Or if a put request has invalid model, then it can reply with HTTP status 404, that is bad request. Some of the other are HTTP status code 200. It is generated when request is success. Another is status code 500, internal server error, when .NET exception is generated in code. By default, all .NET exceptions are translated into HTTP response with status code 500, that is internal error. It is possible to register exception filters. For example, you can see here. Modern validation like MVC web API supports data annotation, system.component model.data annotation. Here you can see there is an example in product, public class product. If you want to get a required field for a name, then you can put system.component model.data annotation and required. For if you want to give a range for a price, then you can also give a range like this. Here you can see the model validation example. Here you can see in HTTP response message post method, if model.itsState valid, then it will go inside it. But if inside that it throws an error, then it will throw a new HTTP response execution error, exception error. Model validation filter attribute. Create a filter attribute. You can also create your filter attribute like this. Add it to filters in global.aspx application start. If you create your filter attribute, then it is mandatory to add in your global.asax application start method to initialize that filter. Here you can see application start method have initialization of a filter. For references, you can go through tutorialspoint.com, ASP.NET Web API and csharper.com. Let's end this session. Thank you for watching.